what would be a definition, I guess, of an isometric, and why is it something that you're so passionate about and you've dedicated so much work and research to?
For simple understanding, isometric is just simply us producing force without external movement. So things like wall sit, prone plank, that's isometric. That's whole isometric, meaning we are resisting a certain amount of force without movement. And then there's push isometric, whereby we are exerting force against something we can't move. I started off with isometric training while working with our judo athlete. One reason why I included isometric training was because if you look at judo fights, judo bout, they actually involve a lot of isometric contraction, struggling, holding, trying to hold down the opponent and stuff like that. When I realized that isometric training actually works, so I started including it for a group of swimmers as well. And it helped them to get really strong. That also transferred to their performance in the water.
Ankle ISO, knee ISO,
Yeah.
and hip ISO, just to name a few. What would be some important things to consider when introducing it to a group of athletes that perhaps haven't got any background?
So the concept of adaptation to isometric training is pretty similar to dynamic training, right? For dynamic training, I use squat, for example. I will do a full range squat, right? I'll do a deep squat because I want to increase my strength throughout a greater range of movement. So if I implement isometric training, it would be the same thing. If I want to get the person to improve strength through a greater range of movement, I will get them to squat to a lower depth, maybe get to a parallel squat position and perform the isometric contraction at that particular position. Just like dynamic training, if you want to induce hypertrophy, you want to have a higher volume. So in isometric context, it would be a longer duration contraction. For example, if I want to induce hypertrophy, then I would get the person to perform isometric contraction for 20 seconds instead of just 5 seconds.
Your general build-up phase, like what type of frequency do you think is minimum to make a change? And then how many exercises do you like to fit that in within the dynamic strength training in terms of isometrics?
Okay, so in general, what I usually recommend is to mix isometric training with dynamic strength training as well, right? So let's say you usually have 3 to 4 sets of squats, 3 to 4 sets of heavy squats. I will recommend replacing 1 or 2 sets of the heavy squats with isometric squats. So yeah, just to have that combination. Isometric has its pros and cons, dynamic has its pros and cons, and if you put them together, you can sort of offset the flaws of each training method and then allow the athletes to get a more optimized adaptation.
And you mentioned pairing it with plyometrics. I think you looked at that with your masters and sprinting activities. What are the benefits?
Not necessarily. They can actually include isometric throughout the training phase. We did a study that was 24 weeks long, and we showed that if we included isometric throughout the 24 weeks, the athletes actually improved their jump, sprints, and strength better than the group that did not include the isometric training. All this can be periodized. One of the advantage of isometric training is that you get to recover faster. So one of our studies we did was we compared a full session of isometric training versus heavy dynamic training. Within 24 hours, the isometric condition went back to baseline. Some of the participants actually jump and sprint faster on 24 hours later. But with heavy resistance training, 24 hours was not enough to recover back to baseline.
For athletes or coaches as well, what are some of the common mistakes that you've heard of or seen when it comes to integrating isometric training with dynamic strength training?
I wouldn't say mistake, but rather a different perspective of how they implemented isometric training. A few months back, I posted on the isometric benny calf hold. And so I was looking at the position of performing that bend knee calf hold, if the vector of force, so I'm holding on a Smith machine, then the vector of force is this way, right? Like it's coming down directly. And then my shin angle is actually slanted. Then it becomes not exactly how the vector of force would be during a sprint acceleration, because during the sprint acceleration, vector of force would be in line with the shin angle, right? But if I'm holding a barbell, the vector of force would be this way, where my shin angle is this way. Then the stress on the joint will be different. So when we implement isometric training, or not just isometric training, but all sorts of training, and we want to be movement specific, joint position specific, we also have to bear in mind the vector of the force, the direction of the force.